the sensor officer on Cathera Way. Station saw it first. She was on the night watch, which meant nothing because there was no night in space. But the station ran on a 26-hour cycle. And at 300 everything felt thin and slow. She had been watching the same empty patch of space for 6 hours. Then the patch was not empty. She filed it as an anomaly, an hour. Later she filed it as debris, an hour. After that, as a derelict vessel. Something old probably, something that had been drifting for a long time and finally drifted here. Then it moved, not much, not fast, just a small correction. The kind of makes when it is keeping station, when something inside it is still alive and paying attention. 3 km to the left, then it stopped again. She stared at her screen for a long time. Then she called her supervisor. The ship sat 40,000 km off the way. Station's docking ring and said nothing. It was massive, not in the clean, elegant way of imperial warships, which were built to look powerful, but in the blunt, heavy way of something built to survive. Every line of it said function, nothing said beauty. The hull was dark gray where it was not, scorched black, and it was scorched black in a lot of places. The first drone footage came back 6 hours after the initial sighting. The xenobiology team on the way station looked at the scans and went quiet. The damage on the hull was not from weapons. They knew what weapons did. Clean cuts of energy beams, the craters of kinetic rounds, the particular way that explosions left their signatures on metal. This was not that. Something had bitten this ship, something large with something that worked like teeth had closed on the hull and worried at it. Again and again across what looked like a very long stretch of time. Some of them had been partially welded shut from the inside, rough work done under pressure without caring how it looked, and then bitten open again, then welded again, then bitten again. The xenobiologist filed her report and included a line at the bottom: no known organism or weapon in the Galactic registry matches this damage profile. She underlined it. Then she deleted the underline because it seemed unprofessional. Then she put it back. Grand Admiral Valesur of the Karathi 3rd Fleet received the report on his flagship at 900. He read it standing up, which was unusual for him. He was 300 years old and had commanded more battles than most species had fought in total, and he had developed the habit of reading difficult reports while seated because it projected calm. He read this one standing. The ship had not responded to standard hails, not to formal imperial frequencies, not to emergency channels, not to the basic mathematical pulse sequences used for first contact with species that had not yet developed language. Then someone tried a tight beam transmission at very close range using an old broad spectrum protocol that covered 17 different language families. The ship responded, one word, transmitted back on all 17 frequencies at the same time in all 17 languages, including 3 that the registry listed as extinct, languages belonging to species that no longer existed anywhere in the known galaxy. The word was occupied. Valesur read the report. He looked at the damage patterns on the hull that matched nothing in 6 centuries of records. He called an emergency council session. The debate ran 6 hours. One admiral called it a ghost ship, automated systems running on a dead Vessel responding with fragments of old code. A diplomatic minister called it a trap. A rival power testing imperial response times and waiting to see what came out. A military strategist called it a weapon. Platform sitting in dormant mode waiting for an order. Nobody had a good answer for the extinct languages. Nobody had a good answer for what had bitten the hull. Veilsor listened to all of it. He was a patient man. He had learned over 3 centuries that letting people speak emptied the room of bad ideas before you had to act on them. When everyone was done, he said, "It's a problem, we treat it like a problem." He dispatched 12 warships, a full battle group. They would surround the vessel, not destroy it. They would establish a perimeter. They would wait for more information before making any decisions. That could not be walked back. He would later think a great deal about the difference between surrounding something and containing it. The battle group arrived at Cathero space 6 hours later and formed a loose sphere around the mysterious vessel. 12 Imperial warships, all weapons ready, surrounding a single damaged ship that still was not moving and still was not talking. Up close, the ship was worse. The damage that had looked severe in drone footage looked catastrophic in person. There were sections of hull that were simply gone, not blown away but removed, taken. The edges of the gaps were smooth in a way that made the engineers on the Imperial vessels feel cold without knowing exactly why. Internal systems were visible through the openings. Some of them were still running. Lights blinked in the dark of exposed corridors. Something inside was still alive. The battle group commander sent another hail. The ship said nothing. He sent a second one. Nothing. He was preparing the third when his sensor officer touched his arm and pointed at a screen. The hull material scan results had just arrived. Standard procedure. You scan the composition of unknown vessels to learn what you could about their origin and technology. It usually told you things like alloy, composition, construction age, manufacturing origin. This told him something different. The hull showed stress fractures, specific kind of stress fractures. The pattern was consistent with sustained combat at relativistic speed, a large fraction of the speed of light. The thermodynamic math of fighting battle at those velocities inside any kind of atmosphere or gravitation field was almost impossible to calculate. The heat alone should have he stopped reading. He transmitted the report to Grand Admiral Veilsor. Then he sat in his command chair and looked at the damaged ship sitting quietly in the middle of his firing arc and thought about what kind of thing you would have to be fighting that would make you do that. Veilsor read the second report the way he had read the first one, standing. He did not share it with the council. He had begun without making a formal decision about it, collecting pieces of information that he was not ready to let other people have yet. This was not something he had done before in 3 centuries of service. He was not entirely comfortable with it. But the pieces kept arriving and each piece fit the others in a way that was building toward a picture he did not want confirmed too fast in a room full of people who made decisions based on what they were afraid of. He looked at the star chart, at the position of the mysterious vessel, at the region of space it had come from, based on its entry trajectory and the faint ion trail his best navigators had managed to reconstruct after hours of careful work. The trail led back toward the Veil. The Veil, the dead zone at the edge of explored space where every probe the Empire had ever sent past the boundary had disappeared without returning. 6 centuries of probes, none of them came back. The Science Ministry had long ago classified the region as structurally hostile and of no value. The damaged ship had come from there. Whatever had bitten it had been out. There, the lights inside the exposed corridors kept blinking in the dark. Veilsor went to bed. He did not sleep. The Imperial delegation boarded through a cargo airlock on the ship's lower port side. It was the only accessible entry point. Every other external hatch had been sealed from the inside, welded shut in. Most cases with a kind of thick, uneven seams that meant someone had done it fast and under pressure without caring how it looked. The cargo airlock itself had been cut open at some point and resealed 3 times. The edges of the frame showed 3 distinct layers of emergency weld, each one slightly different in technique, as if done on different days by someone getting faster and better at it each time. The delegation was 12 people, 4 diplomats, 2 translators, 3 xenobiologists, a medical officer, and 2 armed security personnel who had been told to look calm. They did not look calm. The corridor beyond the airlock was scorched, not uniformly, not the way an engine fire scorches a ship, but in streaks and patches, as if something fast and very hot had moved through the space and not cared about staying in one place. The walls were dark. Emergency lighting ran along the floor in dim red strips. Somewhere deeper in the ship something hummed. At the end of the corridor was a blastrated door. The xenobiologist walked up to it and looked at the surface. She counted 7 separate layers of emergency repair on the door's face, welds over welds over welds. The door had been breached, sealed, breached again, and sealed again. She stopped counting at 7 because the pattern was making her feel something she did not want to name out loud. There were claw marks in the door, deep ones, biological, not mechanical. Arc and spacing of them was consistent, with something large pressing very hard. The marks had been sealed over, but they were still there, visible under the welds if you looked closely enough. The security personnel moved their hands closer to their weapons and said nothing. The door opened from the other side, the woman standing in the corridor. Beyond it was human, though none of the delegation had ever met a human before. They had read the preliminary files Veil Sorrel had prepared, bipedal mammalian, oxygen breathing, native to a system not in the registry, but the files had not prepared them for the specific experience of standing in front of one. She was in her 40s, medium height. She had the look of a person who had been lean before and was now thin in a different way, the kind that happened when a body burned through all of its reserves and kept going anyway. There were burn scars on her forearms and on the left side of her neck. Her eyes were dark and steady, and she was eating noodles out of a metal container using a small utensil the delegation had no name for. She looked at the 12 of them without any surprise on her face at all. She said in the Galactic trade tongue, not perfectly, but well enough. You took longer than I expected. You want some noodles? I have 2 packets left and I'm trying to be generous before I run out. The head diplomat tried 3 times to begin the formal imperial greeting protocol. It was a long greeting. It established precedent and lineage and the ancient authority of the Sharathi imperial seat, and it had been used at every first contact the empire had conducted in the past 4 centuries. The woman, her name it turned out was Commander Mara Vass, let him finish all 3 attempts. She was polite about it. She nodded in what seemed like the right places. Then she said, "How long have I been parked in your space?" I had a rough approach and my chronometer was giving me bad readings for a while. I want to make sure someone filed the right paperwork. The translator looked at the diplomat. The diplomat looked at the translator. Vass waited. She had the patience of someone who had learned how to wait and stopped finding it difficult. The formal questioning began an hour later in the ship's mess hall, which was the largest intact interior space the delegation could find. Most of the ship was either sealed off, exposed to space through hull gaps, or too damaged to enter safely. The mess hall had 4 walls and a ceiling and air, which was enough. Vass sat on one side of the table. The diplomats sat on the other. The xenobiologists moved around the edges of the room, taking quiet scans of everything, trying not to be obvious about it. They were obvious about it. The questions were careful and built slowly toward what everyone wanted to know. Vass answered them in order. She was from a species called human. Yes, her home system was Sol. She gave coordinates. No, it was not in the registry. She was aware of that. She had been the commanding officer of this vessel, the Unbroken, on a deep range exploration mission. The ship had been rated for 400 crew. She said that last part the way people say things they have said many times to themselves in empty rooms and mean something different each time. Then she said, "You're going to ask where I came from, the specific entry vector." The lead translator confirmed that yes. This was the next question. Vass gave the coordinates. The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when a piece of information arrives that cannot be processed immediately by the people who received it. Those coordinates were beyond the veil. Not near the veil, not approaching the boundary, inside the dead zone, past the point where Imperial probes stopped returning, deep in the region 6. Centuries of science had mapped as structurally hostile and of no use to anyone. The xenobiologist by the window stopped taking scans. The diplomat cleared his throat. He said very carefully, "What is beyond the veil, Commander?" Vass looked at the camera drone in the corner of the room. She had noticed it the moment she walked in. She had said nothing and let them keep it. Now she looked directly at it, which meant she was looking at Vale Sorrow, who was watching the live feed from his flagship, and she looked at him for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. Then she said, "You don't want to know." The medical officer traveling with the delegation filed a quiet report to the Admiral during the first break. It listed what the passive bioscan had found: 14 healed bone fractures across the skeleton, plasma burn scarring on the lower body, neurological stress markers consistent with 14 to 18 months of continuous high threat response, the kind the body produces when it stays in a state of serious danger for an extended period without rest. The report was factual and clinical and professional throughout. At the bottom, the medical officer had written one line outside the formal structure: "This individual should not be alive." Vale Sorrow read it. He added it to his collection of things. He was not sharing with the council. The collection was growing faster now. Before the session ended, Vass made 2 requests. The first was a functioning shower. The delegation granted this immediately and sent someone to find her one before the session was even officially closed. The second was confirmation that Earth had been notified she was alive. The translator conveyed the request. There was a pause. A lead diplomat consulted quietly with the others. Then he turned back and said carefully, "We are unfamiliar with Earth." The first 12 responses that moved across Mara Vass's face came fast and were difficult to read. The 13th was worry. Real worry, not the performed kind or the manageable kind that a person controls with training and experience. The deep kind. The kind that looked like someone who had been running very hard to a finish line and had just been told the finish line was in the wrong place. She said, "How far does your registry go?" He gave the edge of map space, the known boundaries, the full extent of what the Empire had cataloged in 6 centuries of expansion. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "We need to move faster than this." Nobody in the room knew what she meant by that. She did not explain it. She picked up her empty noodle container and walked out, and the delegation sat in the dim red light of the dead ship's mess hall and felt one by one that they had just been told something important in a language none of them had learned yet. The Imperial Council made its decision. On the 3rd day, the Unbroken was an unregistered vessel in Imperial space. The human was an unclassified sapient life form, not in the registry, not covered by any existing treaty, not recognized under any law the Empire had on record. Under Imperial Code, both the ship and its occupant had to be processed, assessed, held until their legal status could be properly determined. The Council sent the order down. Vale Sorrel received it on his flagship. At 700, he sat with it for 11 seconds. For a Karasi admiral with 3 centuries of service, 11 seconds of sitting with a direct order before executing it was a long time. His staff noticed. None of them said anything. He executed the order. Imperial soldiers moved on the Unbroken in full boarding detail. The diplomatic envoy was pulled back to the way station. 2 shuttles of armed personnel docked at the cargo airlock, the only way in, and moved through the scorched corridors toward the mess hall where Vass had been staying. She was there when they arrived. She looked at the soldiers. She looked at their weapons. She set down her coffee, real coffee, the last of it. Supplies she had been rationing for months, one careful cup at a time, and she stood up and put her hands where they could see them. She said, "Okay." She did not resist. She did not argue. She asked one question calmly while they secured her wrists. "Am I being charged with something specific, or is this a classification?" "Hold." The soldier in charge said it was a classification. Hold. She nodded. She said, "All right." They walked her out through the corridors of her ship. She looked at the walls as she went, not at the soldiers, not at the exits, at the walls, the weld marks, the blastrated door at the end of the main corridor that had been sealed and resealed and bitten open and sealed again. She looked at all of it the way you look at something that cost you everything, and you are not yet sure if it was worth it. She didn't say anything else. This was somehow the most unsettling thing the soldiers experienced all day. While Voss sat in a detention cell on the way station, Imperial technicians began working on the Unbroken's data core. It was badly damaged. Large sections were corrupted or simply gone. What they could pull was fragmented pieces of logs, partial sensor records, navigation data with gaps big enough to fly a ship through. The technicians worked for 16 hours straight, running recovery protocols, piecing together what they could from what was left. What they recovered covered the last 8 months of the Unbroken's journey home from beyond the veil. The chief technician reviewed the initial reconstruction and sent a direct flag to the admiral. The flag said, "You need to see this, not the council." You. Vailsur reviewed the sensor logs in his private quarters alone. The logs described things moving in the dark beyond the veil, large things fast. Things that did not match any entry in the registry or any theoretical model in 600 years of imperial science. The logs described engagements, the Unbroken running, turning, fighting, pulling back and running again across distances and time frames that seemed impossible for a single ship with a crew that was getting smaller every week. The logs described the corridor home. There was a natural fold in space at the veil boundary, a place where the geometry was soft, where a ship that knew the exact angle could push through and come out on the other side in imperial space. The Unbroken had found it, had been using it as a navigation point on the long journey back. But the things in the dark had found it too, and they were following her through. The last recorded action in the partial logs was Voss rerouting the ship's FTL drive, not to make a jump but to deliberately overload the drive in a controlled way at the fold point, using the resulting explosion to collapse the corridor closed behind her. The fold was gone now. The technicians had checked. There was nothing at those coordinates. Whatever door had existed there was sealed. Vailsur put down the data tablet. The Admiral of Sciences, given the same logs, submitted a formal summary. Whatever is beyond the veil is not alone. It is aware of us, and the human vessel appears to have prevented it from following her back. He then requested an immediate reassignment to a desk posting in the core worlds as far from the frontier as the Empire reached. His request was denied 48 hours after Voss had first asked about Earth. A signal arrived. It came from a direction no one had been watching, a vector approaching Cathera space from the far side, not from the veil, from deeper into what the Empire had assumed was empty, unoccupied territory. The signal was not a hail. It was not a distress call. It was a fleet transponder registration. 47 ships dropped out of faster-than-light travel in a loose formation on the opposite side of the way station from the Imperial battle group. Human ships, different class from the Unbroken, newer, harder-edged, built by people who had learned things and applied them, but with the same logic. Underneath, function first, built to work, not to impress. They held position. They did not advance. The lead ship opened a hail on standard diplomatic frequencies, a voicemail, even in tone, calm in the way of someone who had practiced being calm and gotten very good at it, said, "This is Captain Darren Hale, UES Perseverance. We are here for our people. We would prefer to do this politely. Please advise on your intentions." The Imperial Battle Group commander looked at his screens. 47 ships unknown. Weapons unknown, speed unknown. Everything except that they had arrived from a direction that was supposed to be empty, which meant the galaxy was considerably less empty than anyone had assumed. He sent the feed to Valser and waited for orders. Valser looked at the feed. He looked at 47 ships sitting in perfect formation at the edge of Cathara space and asked himself quietly how long they had been there waiting just out of range and how they had known where to come. He sent a response. The human vessel and its crew were being held under standard Imperial classification protocols. The situation was under review. He asked the human fleet to maintain their current position while formal processes were followed. There was a short pause. Captain Hale said, "Understood. We'll wait." And they waited. For 11 hours nothing happened. Both fleets sat at opposite ends of Cathara space and looked at each other across a great distance of nothing. The way station ran at full alert. Nobody slept. The tension was the specific kind that comes not from aggression but from two groups of people who do not know each other, trying very hard not to make the kind of mistake you cannot take back. Then a gunner on one of the Imperial warships made a mistake. He had been awake for 30 hours. He was young. He was watching 47 unknown ships on his targeting display, and his hands were on the controls, and the protocol for warning shots was very clear in his training. One ranging shot off the bow communicates back down in every military language in the known galaxy. 6 centuries of Imperial doctrine confirmed this. It had always worked. He fired. Round hit the forward shields of the Perseverance. The shields held. There was a very long pause. Then Captain Hale's voice came back over the channel, still calm, with no specific change in tone that anyone could point to, but with something underneath it that felt different from anything that had come before. He said, "All right, we'll do it the other way." The 47 ships moved in her detention cell on the way station. Voss heard it through the hull. Distant, muffled, the specific sound of weapons fire conducted far enough away that it arrived as vibration more than noise. She had spent 19 months learning to recognize that sound in all its forms. She closed her eyes. She sat very still for a moment. Then she said to the walls, to the empty room, to no one at all, "I told you." She did not say what she had told them. She said it quietly, the way you say things that are already done and already past and no longer inside your hands. She leaned her head back against the wall. Outside, 9 minutes away, the Battle of Cathara Way Station was beginning. The Imperial Tactical Report filed. After it was thorough and careful and written by an analyst who added a note at the end that she almost deleted 3 separate times before leaving it in. The note said, every position the human fleet held during the engagement had been chosen to push Imperial vessels away from the combat zone rather than destroy them. Ships that took critical damage were shoved out of the fight. Disabled vessels were left alone. No finishing shots, no pursuit of retreating ships. The humans had not been trying to win the battle. They had been moving pieces. The analyst had run the engagement geometry 4 times to make sure she was reading it correctly. The Imperial fleet was now sitting in a defensive screen around the veil. Boundary, exactly the position it needed. To hold if something came through from the other side. She did not know if the humans had planned this or if it was coincidence. She suspected it was not coincidence. She deleted the note. Then she put it back. The Empire went to war the way it always had, with everything. 300 years of military doctrine said the fastest way to end a conflict was to end it completely, with a force so large and so decisive that the other side ran out of options before they could adapt. The Empire had 6 centuries of proof that this worked. It had worked against the Keth rebellion. It had worked against the Sauran frontier wars. It had worked against every threat the Empire had ever faced, because every threat had eventually run out of things to lose. The War Council convened within 48 hours of Cathera. The math was laid out. Clearly, humanity occupied 1 star system, possibly a small number of colonies in nearby space. The Empire commanded 700 star systems, 12 allied species, and the largest active military fleet in the galaxies. Recorded history. The math was obvious. The math was completely wrong. The first 3 Imperial offensives hit human positions hard. The humans took serious damage. They gave ground on every tactical report that came back from the front. They looked like a smaller force being steadily pushed back by a much larger one. Then the analysis team started noticing the pattern. Every single retreat was clean. Every withdrawal left the Imperial advance pointed somewhere specific. In the second offensive, the Empire pushed the human fleet out of a contested system near the Mer corridor and found themselves holding a supply lane could not use, because the humans on the way out had placed proximity mines at the corridor's entry point, dense enough to make it impassable for 6 months. The mine placement had required precise knowledge of Imperial fleet movement patterns. Nobody had told them those patterns. They had simply watched and learned and acted on what they saw. In the third offensive, the Empire committed 200 warships to a sweep of the ORF Nebula. The human force in the area was 43 ships. They should not have survived the engagement they held for 6 hours, absorbed serious damage, and then pulled back in perfect formation without losing a single vessel. The Imperial Admiral declared victory and filed his report. His analyst looked at the star chart for a long time without saying anything. Then she told him this human fleet was now sitting between Imperial space and the Veil boundary in a defensive formation that covered every navigable approach to the border. The Empire's own fleet, the fleet that had just won a battle, was sitting behind them, pointed in the wrong direction. The analyst said, "We are exactly where they want us to be." The Admiral said, "That's impossible." She said, "This is the 3rd engagement in a row with the same tactical signature." He did not have an answer for that. 3 of the Empire's 7 allied species requested emergency meetings in the 4th week of the war. Not to commit forces, not to offer resources. They came with their own analysts, their own reconstructed fragments of the unbroken state of logs, pieces bought from way station workers, pulled from intercepted Imperial intelligence feed, assembled over weeks of quiet and careful work. They had been running their own math. The Keth ambassador sat across from Vale Essor and put a data tablet on the table and said nothing for a moment. The tablet showed a map, the map showed the veil boundary, the map showed the current position of both the human and Imperial fleets. The Keth ambassador tapped the veil boundary, he said, they are not here. For us. Veil Essor said nothing. The Keth ambassador said, they were never here for us. In a secured room on the Perseverance. Voss talked for 11 hours straight. She had been released as a political gesture, the War Council's calculation that returning one prisoner might slow the pace of the human offensive, but Voss was back on the ship, clean and rested and sitting across from Captain Hale, and she told him everything she had not yet been able to tell anyone. She told him about the 19 months, about the things in the dark beyond the veil, what they looked like, how they moved, how they seemed to think, as far as she had been able to understand, something that fought in ways that did not fit any framework she had arrived with. She told him about the crew, first the small losses, then the larger ones, then the end. She told him about the fold in space and what she had done to close it, and what it had cost and why she had done it anyway. Hale listened. He was a man who had commanded ships in difficult situations for 20 years and had the kind of face that had processed a great deal of very bad news and learned to receive the next piece without flinching. When she finished, he sat in silence for a while. Then he said, "How long do we have?" She said, "Less than we're spending on this." He nodded once. He did not ask anything else. He understood what she meant, and he knew what it required, and he went to work. Veil Essor requested the private channel. On the 42nd day of the war. No council present, no official record. A direct transmission to the human fleet, flagged specifically for Commander Voss, an unusual thing for a Grand Admiral of the Karathi Empire to do, and his communication staff processed the request without any comment at all, because they had learned over the past 6 weeks to process his unusual requests quietly. Voss took the call. Veil Essor asked his question directly, because he was 300 years old and had stopped building toward things a long time ago. "What did you fight out there?" She told him. He did not speak for 90 seconds. Then, "How did you survive?" She said, "We didn't mostly, but the ones who did learned fast." He was a soldier. He understood attrition. He understood the arithmetic of survival in impossible situations. He understood exactly what she meant by that sentence and all the weight it carried. He said, "Why didn't you tell anyone before, when you first found them? Why didn't you come to the rest of the galaxy?" Voss was quiet for a moment, then she said, "We looked at the options, we looked at how this galaxy works, we figured panic wouldn't help." He had no answer for that either. He had been a Grand Admiral for 90 years, and he had watched panic drive decisions in council rooms more times than he could count, and he knew she was right. And the knowing sat in him like a stone. The Imperial Science Ministry released its complete analysis on the 47th day, classified at the highest possible level, 12 recipients total. Veil Essor read his copy alone in his private quarters at 200, because that felt like the right time to read something like this. The analysis was thorough, it was careful, it used qualified language throughout and noted its own uncertainty clearly. The conclusions, hedged as they were, said this: what lay beyond the veil was not a species, it was a front Something that moved the way a tide moves, or the way fire moves across dry land, not choosing targets but consuming everything in its path, because that was what it did. It had been doing this for a very long time, longer than the Karathi Empire, longer than any recorded galactic history. The ministry could not determine whether it was biological or mechanical, or something that existing categories simply did not cover. The Unbroken had drawn it, had run from it across 250 million kilometers of deep space, fighting constantly, keeping it occupied, buying time with crew members and hull plating, and the dwindling supply of everything the ship had finally collapsed the entry corridor, a maneuver that should have destroyed the Unbroken entirely. One person had done this. Vale Essor put down the report. He thought about the word occupied, transmitted in 17 languages, including 3 extinct ones, languages belonging to species that had perhaps once encountered something in the dark and not survived to tell about it, except in records that one damaged ship had somehow carried home across an impossible distance. He thought about 11 seconds. He filed his ceasefire request at 300. Unilaterally, without council approval, without consulting anyone. His communications officer processed the transmission without comment. The war did not end with the request. It never ended fast. Wars had their own momentum. The Empire was large and slow-turning and full of people who had not read the classified reports and were still working from the original math, the math that said this should have been resolved weeks ago. Battles that were already in motion continued, ships already committed to engagements followed through. But something shifted in the rooms where the people who had read the right reports sat together quietly after the official sessions ended. The nature of the conversations changed. The question stopped being, how do we win this, and became something else, something quieter and harder to put words to. The question was, what are we doing to each other while the walls are making noise? It was never phrased exactly that way in any document or any record, but it was the question being asked in those rooms by people who had looked at the same data and arrived at the same place. The fighting went on for 19 more days. The neutral station sat above a gas giant that nobody had ever named. Nobody had needed to. It was far from everything. Far from Cathera and its wreckage, far from Earth and the places humanity had been quietly building for 40 years. Far from the veil boundary that everyone in every room had been trying not to look at on the star charts for weeks. The planet below was orange and cream, enormous and slow and completely indifferent to what was happening above it. The negotiating room was plain, long table, chairs, tall windows looking out at the swirling colors of the giant below. The Empire had set it up. The humans had approved it. They had agreed on the location by elimination. Everything closer to either side space felt like home territory, and nobody wanted to spend the first day fighting about the furniture. Voss sat on the human side with Captain Hale and 3 diplomats who had been fully briefed and were doing a good job of not showing it. Vale Essor sat on the Imperial side with 4 council members and a Keth ambassador who had asked to observe the proceedings and been allowed to stay. Outside the windows, the gas giant turned in its slow, ancient pattern. It did not care about any of this. The Empire expected demands. Every war ended with demands. That was how wars worked. The side that performed better in the fighting asked for territory, resources, and reparations. There was a long tradition to it, almost a ritual, and the tradition said you fought until you ran low. And then the side that was less broken told the side that was more broken what stopping would cost. The human delegation put 3 items on the table. 1. Full recognition in the Galactic Registry. Humanity as a registered sapient species with the Sol system and all current colonial holdings designated as sovereign territory under galactic law. A formal seat on a new joint council body to coordinate between species on matters of shared strategic interest. They had been working on it for some time. 3. Immediate joint military cooperation on a coordinated defensive posture along the Veil boundary. The council looked at the 3 items. The senior council member said carefully that the Empire had prepared for a much longer list. Voss said, "We don't have time for a longer list." Veil Sore looked at her from across the table. She met his eyes. He had spent 40 days in a war with her species and had not been able to tell, looking at her face, what she was afraid of. He still could not tell. He had begun to wonder if it was a cultural thing or a personal one, and then he had read the full medical report and stopped wondering and accepted that some questions about Mara Voss were not going to resolve into comfortable answers. The full briefing came on the 2nd day of talks. Voss presented it herself, no diplomatic filter, no summary prepared by someone else, the full account, everything from the Unbroken's logs and her own memory, laid out in plain sequence from the first probe result to the moment the fold corridor collapsed behind her. When she finished, the room held its silence for a long time. The senior council member asked how long humanity had known about what lay beyond the veil. Voss said, "Since the 3rd probe we sent past the boundary, 40 years ago." How long had they been preparing? 40 years. The room processed this. The Cathar ambassador had been present for 17 centuries of galactic history. He had not reacted visibly to anything across 2 full days of proceedings. Now he was quiet for a long moment, looking at Voss with the particular attention of someone recalibrating something fundamental. He said, "You knew for 40 years and you told no one and you prepared alone." Voss said, "We looked at the options." He said, "You decided that telling the galaxy would cause decisions made fast in rooms full of frightened people cause exactly the kind of war we just spent 40 days fighting, except with the veil at our backs while we fought it." She paused. "We decided the galaxy didn't need to know until we had something to show for the knowing." The room was quiet again. The Cathar ambassador looked at her for a long moment. He said, "You are a very strange people." Voss said, "That tracks. The Unbroken could not be saved." Everyone agreed on this without much discussion. The structural damage was too deep, the systems too far degraded, the hull too compromised in too many places. There was nothing left there to repair, only something to preserve or to dismantle or to let drift. Voss filed a formal request through the new Joint Commission. The request asked for the ship to be towed to stable orbit above the neutral station. Coordinates, a date, nothing else. No explanation of why. The Commission Approved it. On the date specified, both fleets held. Position, human imperial allied. Species, every flag represented in the combined force. Nobody had sent a formal order for this. Nobody had announced it. The word had moved from ship to ship the way these things move, quietly between people who understood what was being asked without needing it explained. The Unbroken came in slow, pulled by two small tugs against the gas giant below. It looked enormous, enormous and damaged, and hollowed out in somehow from certain angles in certain light still, carrying something that was hard to name. The amber light from the planet moved across the scarred hull in long slow patterns. Voss stood at a viewport on the Perseverance. Hale stood next to her. He had learned over weeks of working alongside her when not to ask. She said 381 people. That was all she said. The Unbroken had a crew rating of 400. Voss had been one of 19 survivors. She had been the last one standing when the corridor closed. Hale stood there and said nothing, because there was nothing that a person could say in that moment that would do anything useful. And Hale was a man who did not speak when speech had no function. The ship turned slowly in its new orbit. The amber light kept moving. The Galactic Registry formally added Homo sapiens on the fourth day of talks. It was a formality by that point. Everyone at the table already understood what humanity was and what it represented. But formalities existed for a reason. They put things in the permanent record. They made agreements real in a way that conversations in rooms could not quite manage. Vale Soar sponsored the motion. Personally, this was unusual. Sponsorship of registry editions was normally an administrative act, a clerical function, handled below the admiral level. He did it anyway. In his formal address, he did not call humanity an ally. He did not call them heroes. He did not reach for the language of celebration, because that language would not have been accurate. And he was, above most things, a precise man. He called humanity what the galaxy needed, whether it wanted them or not. He had worked on the phrasing for 3 days. It was the most honest thing said in any official session of the proceedings. The new Joint Defense Council held its first meeting the following morning. Humanity held its seat, 7 other species held theirs. The Cathar ambassador had stayed on after the negotiations formally concluded, which no one had expected and which no one questioned. The meeting lasted 4 hours. Most of it was operational. Defensive coverage zones, communication protocols, the logistics of coordinating fleets that used different systems and were built around different assumptions and spoke different languages on their internal channels. The work was slow and detailed and necessary. At the end of the session, Vale Soar asked Voss directly what the timeline looked like. She said they had time, probably. The corridor collapse had bought years. Not decades, but years. The thing beyond the veil was patient. The way large things were patient. It did not need to hurry. It would find another approach. Eventually, because it had been doing this for longer than anyone in the room could meaningfully imagine. And patience was one of the few things it had in unlimited supply. But they had time. Vale Soar said, "What do we do with the time?" Voss said, "Build trains, stop fighting each other." A pause. Mostly the last one. The night after the first joint council. Meeting ended, Voss was alone in a corridor on the Nutri station, late. Station quiet, lights dimmed to their nighttime setting. The kind of silence that exists on large structures when most of the people in them are asleep. She had a mug of coffee, real coffee, shipped from Earth on the resupply run. The first she had tasted in 2 full years. She was standing at a viewport at the end of the corridor. The view was the gas giant below, slow and enormous, and the navigation chart overlay on the window glass, standard display. The veil boundary was on it, the way it was on every chart. A curved line at the far edge of map space, the place where the record stopped and the unknown began. It was just a line on a map. It did not look like anything at all. A junior officer found her there, young, first posting, with the kind of face that had not yet learned the value of being careful before speaking. He stood for a moment uncertain, and then asked, because he was young enough to still ask these things. He said, "Are you scared?" She thought about it. She drank her coffee. She looked at the line on the chart. She said, "Of what?" He did not have an answer. He stood there a moment longer and then walked away down the corridor. And Voss stayed at the viewport with her coffee going slowly cold in her hand, and looked at the line that was not just a line. Somewhere on the other side of it, something was patient. She was more patient. She drank her coffee. The Unbroken's final log entry had been classified for the full duration of the war. After the ceasefire, the families of crew requested its release. The Joint Commission reviewed the request and approved it. The entry was recorded at hour 431 of the running battle beyond the veil. Ship systems were at 11%. Every member of the crew was gone. Whatever had been pursuing her through the dark was still behind her. Mara Voss had sat down in front of the log recorder. She had said 3 words. "Not today." Continuing, the entry became the official record of the Unbroken's final mission. The 3 words were carved into the ship's hull in its orbit above the unnamed planet in the amber light that crossed it once every 14 hours. The galaxy read them in 17 languages. In all 17, they meant the same thing.